So hello everyone. Just to make sure, can you hear me? Perfect. So good. You can. All right. So we are starting. It's 11:32. We said we would start at 11:30. So this is the beginning of the webinar. First of all, welcome everyone to this first webinar of the combo training that's going to take us through the coming 10 weeks. What I would like to do here is first make a brief introduction, share a little bit the context, the format of how the webinar is going to go, what are we aiming at, and then I will actually give the floor to our colleagues, George Ray Molina, who was the lead author of the Regional Human Development Report, and Ken Roy Roach, who was one of the lead authors of the Caribbean Human Development Report. So let me start again by welcoming all of you. This is very exciting. We have just finished the webinar in Spanish, 2 hours for the last 2 hours, and we had over 100 people connected, actually over 100 computers connected. And behind some of the computers, we know there were even 20 people. So we are really thrilled to be part of this process. And now we are starting with 37 participants and 37 computers again, and several participants in some cases behind this computer. So first of all, just to give a little bit of where are we coming from. As many will know, and some of you might not, we did for the last 2 years and a half, 2014 to mid-2016, September 2016, work on the preparation, elaboration, publication, and presentation of a human development report for Latin America and the Caribbean, and within that, a second volume focusing specifically in the Caribbean. These reports that were very welcome and shared with over 20 countries in the region, and leading to working on over 25 countries, now 30 countries in the region, and the 2030 agenda. They had a lot of knowledge that we needed to make it practical. So extracting that knowledge from the reports resulted in several trainings. The first training, and we did that the previous 8 weeks, was about poverty risk, was about transitioning in and out of poverty, and we will see some of those details later. But please bear in mind that there was a first training already, technical training on poverty transitions with a tool called PovRisk. There is a second training, which is the one we're doing now, and it's called Combos. A more technical name might be clustering, but we stick strongly to the concept of combos. We will learn more about it later today. Please remember, this is the first webinar of a training of 10 weeks. So here we are starting to share initial ideas. Something that I would like to share is that the training actually already began. This means that we have already the participants registered. For the PovRisk that is finished, we had 160 people that entered into the training. For this combo training, we have again around that number, 170 I believe, and the training again has begun. So those of you who are hearing of this for the first time, who are not part of the training and would like to be, please, this is the moment to let us know. At the end of the webinar, Andrea de la Torre will be sharing with you her email and the link for you to register in the training. It is today the last day to do so. Again, the training has begun, and it will require you a little bit of extra effort to be up to speed. The rationale behind these trainings is not the trainings for the sake of the trainings, even if, of course, learning is so important. It's the applicability of these trainings. And in this sense, these 10 weeks are going to be really practical. But more importantly, what we are aiming at is at creating, and we have already begun, a regional network of experts in SDGs. So again, from the previous training, we have 90 people that joined this network of experts, and now they can start to apply the PovRisk tool, and they are already applying it. By the end of these 10 weeks, we will have a network of experts that can apply the combo approach and the combo tool in the region. So after my initial remarks, we will have, again, George and Kenroy going deeper into the technical details. But let me please have some initial remarks now so that we know where we are standing. First, the participants are, and this is very exciting, on the one side, government public servants, on the other one, UNDP and UN civil servants, and we have also people from the academia and consultants. And certainly there is a very, very serious team behind doing all the technical work for the workshops to work, for the trainings to be available, for the materials to be corrected. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank that team for an amazing work. How is it going to work today? What's the format? I have these initial remarks, then I'm going to pass the floor to George, who's going to lead us through a technical presentation. And we are going to see there information about poverty transitions, and mainly we are going to start to get familiarized with combos. At some point I was, because so many people have heard of combos, some others haven't, but the ones who have, sometimes we are not quite clear of what we are talking about. So I was even tempted to call this first workshop Demythifying Combos. Anyway, so we will have George and Kenroy. And finally, and Kenroy will lead us through the specificities of the Caribbean, mainly English-speaking Caribbean. And finally, we will have questions and answer session. One thing that I believe it's important to note here, and I think Kenroy will help to make that evident for the case of the English-speaking Caribbean, and hopefully for the Caribbean as such. But I'm sitting today in Haiti, and I have come here together with some other colleagues from the environmental field, etc. We are working with the government of Haiti to see how to advance on the SDGs and how to make the SDGs part of their national narrative, part of the priorities defined by the country itself. And precisely the combo tools tries to go in that direction. So what we are doing here, this is an exploratory mission. We are starting to analyze what will be the next steps to continue advancing. So, what is the context? I already said we did develop these human development reports that took us 2.5 years of very in-depth analysis, and this was the point of departure. We wanted to deepen our knowledge in human development, and this was the vision of our regional director, Jessica Fayeta. Based on that analysis, we wanted to see, and we had the hypothesis that it could work, and we are now seeing that it does, how this knowledge that comes from the Human Development Report can actually become a vehicle to land the SDGs in the region. And that's the exercise we are doing currently for the last year and a half. And finally, again, they should lead to this network of experts that will be the people that, in some cases on their own, in some cases with our support, and always under the leadership of the government, be it national or local, will be applying these tools. In this case, for this training, the combo tool. So as I said, we had the first webinar earlier this morning in Spanish, now we have this one in English. Both are being translated into French. So I'm trying to speak at slow pace, and I ask George and Kenroy to do so that our colleagues have the time to translate this presentation to French so that it can be fully understood. And my first remark here in terms of content, and I think it's important, is that at some point we will be looking at very technical analysis, and we may think that in some of our countries this analysis cannot take place because we don't have that data. Two things to be said here. One, we might not be able to replicate exactly this analysis, but thanks to innovative data gathering and analysis possibilities, we can do, and George will talk about that, we can, with administrative registries, we can do very interesting similar analysis that will allow us to get to some conclusions. And this was our hypothesis, and we are confirming it again, that even in the countries that we cannot do the analysis today, the results that we have found for the countries we have analyzed will still stand. And so in the English-speaking Caribbean, the one country that had data to do this in and out analysis of poverty was Jamaica, and it did confirm the findings that we brought from Latin America. So I think that's something to bear in mind. Me, myself, I worked in Haiti for 3 years, And one of the things that got me more excited at the beginning of the research was that actually the findings we were having really resonated with the reality that we were living in Haiti. So again, even if in some countries we don't have today the data to go through the analysis, we believe that the results stand. The second remark I would like to do, and this is what we are doing today in Haiti, and this initiated in a discussion in Bolivia, is, of course, because this webinar is online, it allows us to be connected literally from anywhere. I mean, some of you might as well be in your beds. Some of you might have had to do some arrangements because it's working hours and you are probably in the offices. But one thing that we wanted to explore, and we are trying it here in Haiti, and we saw that it was a very good idea in Bolivia, is that you could as well initiate a discussion between UNDP country office and the government and maybe get together for these webinars, because then you might want to go through certain discussions of the analysis and of the conclusions that we are finding. So it's up to the respective countries to make these decisions, but you may want to consider the possibility of joining efforts, the webinar days, UNDP and government staff, and maybe other guests as well, so that you can continue a discussion triggered by this webinar. Second thing I wanted to say is, for some of you, this might be your first time. Welcome. For some of you, we might have known each other for a long time now. We did work together in the elaboration of the Human Development Report with some of you. With some of you, we worked in the workshops of Bolivia and Guatemala. With some of you, we have met in the ministerial forums. With some of you, we are already working in country offices. And some of you did participate of that first training that I mentioned on Pro Risk. So all of you are really welcome, and thank you for being here. In the case of Haiti, for instance, we haven't launched the HDR report yet, Human Development Report, and we are planning for the appropriate date to do so. But in the meantime, the government of Haiti, together with the support of UNDP and other instances, they have been working in a multidimensional poverty index, which is, you will see, directly linked to the presentation today, and also in ARUB, Registre Unique des Bénéficiaires, which is an administrative data gathering and analysis system that allows to better focalize the public policies and have updated information with an amazing frequency at an acceptable cost. So some of you may be familiar with it. For some of you, it might be news. But and again, in each case, in each country, it's a different case. But in Haiti, we are looking at the moment to launch the report together with this work that is being done under the leadership of the government. So this is one important remark. We do not believe in silver bullets, and we are trying here very hard to be tailor-made interventions. So. The last thing is, all of you who are here and who will be participating in the training, you will have a key role in the process of landing the SDGs. It is, even if we are already mid-2017 and the SDGs were approved at the end of 2015, which gives us a time frame of about a year and a half, more or less, it's quite new for all of us. Some countries have advanced more, others less, but all of us are trying to figure out how to go forward. And in this sense, this training has the purpose of being extremely practical. Again, you will hear more about the combos later in the presentation from George. But one idea that I would like to share and to have now as a point of departure is the tool and the approach of the combos. What they do is, rather than having a schizophrenic situation where the country priorities live in one side and the international report works on the other, actually what we are acknowledging is that the only way for instance, is national priorities, but making sure that the national priorities are at the center of the analysis, and by deepening this analysis of these multidimensional priorities and doing an intersectorial implementation, by doing this multidimensional analysis, we will find and insert the SDGs within the process. And that's what the combos are about. Again, this is the first webinar for a training supposed to last for the coming 10 weeks. I would like once again to thank the team behind the work that we have been doing here. And every time we name people, there is a risk of leaving people behind, and I would like to, but definitely Wilmer, Andrea, Oscar, Gonzalo, certainly Maria Jose, who's been a key piece during the report, and now George, who we really thank, and he was the lead author of the report and is doing an amazing work now in so many countries. Ken Roy, who has taken the lead for the Caribbean and was one of the lead authors for the Caribbean HDR. Deborah, all the team in the regional hub. I mean, for you to know, there is a very respectful and respected team doing an amazing work here, and I would like to thank them for those efforts. The last two things that I would like to say in this line of thought, that our objective is for the training to be very practical, is one, there is need for capacity development. We need capacities to be able to respond to the demand. And we believe that these trainings can certainly help in that direction, so that the policies that we move forward are evidence-based, and we will see it later, and can be articulated through some tools that we propose here, again, the combos. The second thing I would like to say is we will see it later again. Yeah, 1 second. I'm sorry to interrupt myself, but I have a message here from the organization. Okay, apparently my sound is not so good. I'm getting closer to the mic. So let's see if you can hear me better now. I'm in my closing remarks now. So what I was saying is the second message I would like to convey is that we will see. We are talking about something here that in some sense is really innovative and a revolution, and in some sense is themes that we have been discussing for a long time. I mean, I don't think that intersectoriality will be something that we hear today for the first time. Nonetheless, that we have technical tools and that we have an approach to advance on it, and that we are proposing to go further on it, it's gonna somehow be a revolution. And in that sense, what we have seen is that political will is gonna be key on the one side, and that we know. And on the other, that where we will see the results, the discussion have to happen between the different sectors, etc. But the application of it, the localizing of it, the working of the territories, it's going to prove key, and that's where we believe that results can start to be shown. With no further ado, I would like to pass the floor to George, who will lead us through the presentation. And again, after George, we will have Ken Roy, who will be talking on the realities of the Caribbean and some of the moving forward that has happened. So please, George, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for those introductory words. Greetings from New York to everyone. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you. My name is George Gray Molina, and what I'll be doing today is sharing our approach on how to build an acceleration program for the SDG agenda using some of the work that we've done in the Human Development Report, as Alejandro mentioned before, but also learning from many countries in the region who have been spearheading very innovative, interesting ideas about how to tackle an agenda that is already complex in its origins, and for which we have multiple obstacles, starting with fiscal space, running through institutional capabilities, and ending with just a long list of 169 gaps that we need to tackle for the agenda. So I'll be talking first about, in the first part of my presentation, I'll talk briefly about some of the things that we have learned over the past few months since we have finished the report, and I'll look at some issues that have to do with income-based poverty and vulnerability. I'll look at some issues that have to do with multidimensional poverty and vulnerability. And then I'll look briefly at something we call hard exclusions, things that are based on discrimination and that are unrelated to income or to multidimensional metrics. And then we'll jump right into the cluster approach, the combo approach that we talked about. I'll explain a little bit what we mean by combo. I'll show some examples, and we'll show some steps that will anticipate some of the work that you will be following over the next few weeks with my colleagues, and that reflects a lot of the work that we've done at UNDP and also learning from many governments in the region. So let's get started. The first part will be about where we stand today. So this is more of an exercise of how things look in the region very quickly. Okay, there's on this graph, what you'll see are the income pyramids for a pool of countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. This is for 19 countries. What we've done here is just pool data so we can see what the income pyramid looks for the whole region, but also we can do this country by country. The interesting thing about this for most of the region is that there's sort of two patterns going on. One is that we see a lot of poverty reduction over the past decade, 15 years, for the region as a whole. And then second, we see a stronger role of the middle class. Middle class is the blue in this graph. The poor segment is the pink in this graph, and the yellow segment is the vulnerable. The vulnerable lines we take from previous work done by our colleagues Ortiz and Luis Felipe Lopez Calva. And we define these lines at $4 a day, $10 a day, $50 a day. And of course, we always keep the poverty line of $1.25 a day for the extreme poverty line. So you can see in this pyramid multiple poverty and vulnerability and middle class lines, if you will. What we have found over the past few months is that many governments in the region are focusing on three things on this pyramid. At the bottom, people are focusing mostly on multidimensional poverty. I'm thinking about poverty metrics and poverty policies that go beyond income and focus on education, health, housing, and also in some cases, citizen security issues, nutrition issues, time use issues, access to Wi-Fi or to internet connections in some cases. So we have many interesting examples from the region of countries adopting multidimensional poverty metrics, but also multidimensional poverty policies. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Second focus that we've seen over the past few months is that although a lot of poverty reduction happened in the region over the past 15 years, and in some cases longer, 20, 30 years ago, what we see is that most of these gains are very vulnerable to setbacks. Three of the biggest setbacks are natural disasters, two, changes in economic growth and labor markets, and three, disease and health issues. So those three vectors, those three shocks are part of the story of why we estimate that one of every three people who leave poverty, who exit poverty, fall back in within this period of time over the past 4 years. So it's something that we've been looking at. And the third issue that we think is on the agenda is a look at the hard exclusions. In some cases, this has to do with violence. In some cases, it has to do with violence against women. In other cases, it has to do with discrimination, for things like being a migrant, for sexual identity, for ethnicity, race, or other socio-ethnic markers. So we find the hard exclusion agenda is still very strong in the region. There's still many pending things to focus on. Those are the three focal points that I'll go quickly over right now. So the falling back into monetary poverty, this is something that Alejandro already anticipated. This graph here shows us what we can do country by country in describing upward mobility and downward mobility. So that when we say that, for example, 100,000 people have exited poverty, what we're usually saying is that 200,000 people or 300,000 people exited poverty, but 100,000 or 200,000 fell back in, had downward mobility in the same year. So as we have, if you will, a ladder of success, we also have a ladder that's coming down in each country, in each labor market, in each social protection system. So we find that this is interesting and important because we can disaggregate the dynamics, the policy dynamics behind ascendant upward mobility and behind downward mobility. And we find, of course, our focus mostly focuses on downward mobility. What we want to aim at is understanding vulnerability, understanding resilience at the household level and at the community level, and thinking about what sorts of policies can we take to construct a more resilient profile. So at UNDP over the past couple of years, what we've done is we've done some statistical and econometric work, and I'll be reporting for about 18 countries on this slide, in which what we find is that the upward mobility is mostly linked to labor markets and to education. So we find these to be statistically significant in almost every country, actually. But when we disaggregate the data and we look only at downward mobility, we find that there's a different and more nuanced story that emerges. And here we find that what better explains resilience at the household level is having access to assets like being the owner of a house, or being the owner of your car or taxi or motorcycle, or being the owner of the tools you use for work, and also having access to a formal credit system, access to finance, to savings or credit. These two asset-based vectors are very important for consumption and for income smoothing in times of crisis. The second thing that we find it to be very correlated to resilience is social protection systems, and this is kind of obvious in places that have social transfer set up, that have labor insurance systems or job insurance systems, that have non-contributory pension systems in place, things that compensate for the labor market. Third, we find that a very important thing over the past 15 or 20 years is that the gap in labor market participation between men and women can largely be explained by the access, or lack of access rather, of systems of care. Systems of care that will take care of children, that will take care of the elderly, that will provide a way of moving away from the burden that women are usually tasked with in the care system at the household level. For the time use surveys for which we have access, we know that that figure is about 3 to 1. So women in the region spend about three times as more time on care in the household than men. And that is something that can be addressed by policy, and as we've seen interesting examples coming from different countries in the region. And finally, besides female labor participation, the fourth thing is youth employment and the quality of youth employment. And we found that because of changing dynamics and changing demographic dynamics, that we get a very different story depending on the country we're in. But in all countries, we find that youth employment and female employment tend to be the missing gaps to fill in order to have a stronger poverty exit strategy and also a more resilient strategy against falling back into poverty. All right, let me move to the next couple of topics. As you have heard, in many parts of the region, there are very interesting work done on multidimensional poverty. I won't talk about multidimensional metrics which are in this graph and describe countries for which there is available data based on ECLAC data. I'm going to move directly to the policy side of the multidimensional poverty issues. And this is where there's a lot of innovation. What we found over the past few years is that the countries that have been able to move from census data and from household data to administrative registries, to registries that are collected on everyone who receives a transfer, everyone who receives a service, everyone who is part of a network of a beneficiary of government transfers or subsidies, to the extent that we have these electronic and geo-referenced registries, and most countries of the region have these already, then we can see a big jump in the way that we conduct public policies. In the past, we would have to guess what the correlations were between different parts of a country and the structure of the labor market and the structure of services. Today, we can zoom in household by household, and we can describe the discrepancy and the gaps faced by each household, which are distinct. Household A will have 2 or 3 issues that have to do with housing or with nutrition. House B will have issues that have to do with labor market insertion for the youth, and House C might have issues with violence within the household. So even though we're looking at something that we call a poor neighborhood or a vulnerable neighborhood, there's a lot of difference, heterogeneity, a lot of diversity inside any parish, any community, any small town in any of our countries. So what we've seen is a big leap with the use of administrative registries. The country that has led on this is Colombia in the region. Colombia has built a public policy program and an investment fund that mirrors its multidimensional index, poverty index, so that they have interventions and transfers for each of the dimensions of the dimensions, I'm sorry, of the multidimensional poverty index. And by marrying both and coalescing both the policy intervention and the metrics, they've been able to follow through with millions of people over time with these administrative registries to see how they're doing, getting data once a year, and in some countries now it's almost twice a year. I'm thinking of Dominican Republic, I'm thinking of Honduras, I'm thinking of Brazil, Mexico, who have been picking up data not just once a year, but twice a year for millions of people. And this creates an incredible data set, not just for academics, but for policymakers, because we can follow up on logistics, we can follow up on feedback loops, we can follow up on services for very specific deprivations. Okay, let me focus on the last part of this introduction. So many of the things that we found in our report and also in policy work in the region is that sometimes economic growth is not good enough. Sometimes there are hard exclusions that are not growth dependent, that actually don't change despite having high levels of growth. And I'm thinking of discrimination in wages between men and women, and in some countries between ethnic groups, and in some countries between immigrants and non-immigrants. So this is something that we've been paying attention to in many countries in the region. There's some good practice out there on anti-discrimination laws, on the recognition of collective rights for people, so thinking mostly about indigenous peoples, and also some places in which we've seen positive discrimination yield some significant advances, particularly in political participation of women at the congressional or parliamentary level. So at the regional level, we've seen advances in parliaments, we've seen advances in self-government and indigenous rights, but not so much on the fight against violence against women, and not so much on the fight against racism. So these are big pending issues that we're still tackling at a regional level as the UN system. Okay, so each of the things that I just mentioned, I mentioned income-based poverty, I mentioned multidimensional poverty and vulnerability, and I mentioned hard exclusions. Each of these is actually not a single gap. It's a multidimensional problem. Each of these is a multidimensional problem. So what we've been developing over the past couple of years is thinking systematically about how to address multidimensional problems with intersectoral and multidimensional solutions. And that is what the combo approach is about. It's about the solution side. It's about addressing the problem. It's about public policy. It's not really about data, and it's not really about the problem side. It's mostly about the solution side. So let me show you a couple of graphs on the way that we've been approaching this at the regional level. In this graph, what you'll see is an infograph that shows the 17 Sustainable Development Goals on the left side, on a vertical vector, and then you'll see 169 of the targets on the horizontal vector. And of course, what we know is that no country is able to tackle 169 gaps, and it would probably not be a good idea to tackle each gap. We know from experience in the region that most countries will be reporting on as many data as they can, so they'll report maybe on 100, 150, 200 of the indicators of the SDG agenda. But for policy purposes, more important than reporting on the statistics is focusing on 2, 3, or 4 multidimensional problems that congregate a set of targets and a set of objectives within them. So some of the examples that I'll show you over the next few slides are about these clusters, these combos. We use the word combo. It's sort of an idiosyncratic, popular language, because what it means is simple. When we move into a place, there's some specific needs that people have, and a combo is an answer to that need. If you really want, I don't know, 2 fried chicken and fries and Coke, then well, that's one combo. But someone else is going to want a different recipe. They're going to have a different basket of needs and of demands. So what we're trying to get out with the combo approach is that different countries and even subregions inside a country, different territorial subregions, might have different needs. And if that's the case, then we want to make those explicit and show those in a multidimensional fashion and show that we can work on some of the hardest issues of the development agenda. One second thing that I want to say about this before we continue is that what we have we have found is that although there's been quite a lot of advance over the past year or so on statistics and on mainstreaming some of the SDG goals into our budgets and into our national development plans, where we haven't started to work so far is on the acceleration side. So think of the Combo instrument and the Combo toolkit as an acceleration toolkit. It's an acceleration for a subset of issues, not everything that the government wants to work on, but a subset of issues that are very hard to tackle. So with many countries, we've found that these issues are usually things like violence, malnutrition, extreme poverty, issues that cannot be tackled one gap at a time and that will be hard to address if we fragment and disperse our efforts. So let me start with a few slides. I'm going to show you sort of the differences. On the left side is a gap-based approach, which is very sectoral and it's based on ministries and so on. And on the right, you'll see what we call a cluster-based or a combo-based approach, which is more territorial, which focuses and zooms, almost like a georeferencing tool that zooms in on a certain population and tries to get something done. So on the left side, this is more or less what we in the UN system ourselves have been doing for many years, which is we focused on education, separate from health, separate from water and basic sanitation, separate from gender issues, separate from housing, and so on. And what we found is that we duplicated and fragmented efforts, and each one of these ministries had a budget, but they didn't talk amongst themselves. So we see a lot of fragmentation on the policy side. What we've learned over time is that as we scale our operation into a municipality, into a parish, into a regional government, what we found is that the territorial aspects of these are much better suited to a multidimensional approach. So that think of this example that I'm going to show you here. It comes from El Salvador. And think of this as that red blotch there is a municipality in El Salvador. And this municipality is fighting against citizen insecurity. And what they do is they zoom in on the neighborhoods in which they've had violence and they've had problems. And they zoom in on the age groups of the kids who are at risk, 15 to 25-year-olds in this example. And then they zoom in also on other characteristics of these kids and also of these young adults. And they focus on some of the drivers that have to do with citizen insecurity. So the things that they came up in doing this diagnosis were not just the obvious things like drug-related violence, but things like labor market insertion, things like educational opportunities for young people, things like urbanization, just basic public works, so that you can make sure that wherever you're walking around in your parish, in your municipality, that you have electricity at night, that you can walk around, that it's safe to walk around, and you're not in danger. Things also like access to justice or access to the police services when that's the case. So as I described that's a combo. It's a combo of 4 or 5 interventions with a critical mass over a small group of people. In this case, it's over a couple hundred of kids or young adults in a small municipality of less than 1,000 people. So what we're focusing on is the critical mass of interventions that will change, that will move the needle in one way or another. Most of the examples that I have come from the social sector. Most have to do with extreme poverty and vulnerability. Some have to do with youth employment or female employment. But I invite you to think about what the combo is. What are the 2 or 3 structural issues in your country that you believe could be served with a multidimensional and territorial approach? So one second thing to think about when we contrast the old approach, which is gap by gap, versus the cluster approach, is that we fragment data sets as well. And we all know this, especially in the English-speaking Caribbean. We've always had difficulty in collecting data and evidence and building evidence-based policymaking based on some spotty and incomplete data. So when we think about how things worked in the past, we had a census that would come around once a decade. We might have a household survey or a demographic survey coming in every 5 years or so. And that, frankly, wasn't enough. It wasn't good enough to track poverty or vulnerability or structural issues over time. So that what we've seen countries adopt more and more over the past 5 years in particular is beginning to use administrative registries, which are easier to collect, which we can collect on a cell phone with an Android application created in the country, and which we can collect maybe 100 variables very cheaply using this kind of technology, georeferencing it so we can map it out and we can immediately know how we stand based on households and parishes and communities. And what we now find are many countries now use a dashboard of hundreds of variables. And these variables are georeferenced and they focus all the way down to the community, to the block level, and even to the household level. Some of the biggest examples here are Brazil and Mexico, who started this 10 to 15 years ago. But the newest incomers of this are countries like Dominican Republic and Honduras, who have just done this over the past 2 or 3 years. And I invite you to take a look at what they've accomplished, which is quite incredible. They have now millions of people in their administrative registries. They collect vulnerability data. They collect poverty data. They collect labor market, youth employment, female labor market participation data. And they do it in a way that they can collect data once or maybe even twice a year. And for those of you who are statisticians or economists, if you have a panel, if you can follow what Joe and what Sally are doing in any country over time, then you have a very powerful instrument, because you can start to define, you can start to understand what the structural issues are. If it's access to certain services, or if it has to do with the labor market, or if it has to do with some other demographic issues and so on. So this is something that we ask you to think about as we look into the cluster approach. The combo approach is mostly based on administrative registries and thinking through a data revolution in this respect. Let's go to the next one. And finally, the third thing that we look at and we think is important is the fiscal side and the financing side. And as you know, particularly for the English-speaking Caribbean, this is one of the largest, the biggest constraints for the adoption and for the implementation of the SDG agenda in the big picture. We know that there's limited fiscal space. We know that there's structural issues that have to do with the need for debt reduction and debt reconciliation. And as we work through these issues, there's also some work to be done in-house, which is to start to notice that we have been fragmenting and duplicating some of our fiscal resources. And every Ministry of Education has a youth program. Every Ministry of Health has a youth program. Every housing program has a youth program, and so on. And what we find is there's a lot of duplication going on. There's a lot of fragmentation of existing resources. So we have something called the fiscal toolkit that we've been using to try to create fiscal space for these combos and for these clusters, to try to figure out the most cost-effective way of having an impact at the local level for a group of the population that is vulnerable. Okay, as we move into some of the examples, what we try to do, we try to use the evidence that's out there. And sometimes the evidence is very good and sometimes it's very poor. When the evidence is very good, then we can do very sophisticated analysis. We can do econometric analysis. We're doing it right now in Honduras. We're doing some econometric analysis in Mexico, in Chile. We focus on determinants of poverty exit, poverty re-entry. We can focus on determinants of malnutrition with econometrics and so on. So depending on the country, we can sophisticate the instruments. But in some places, all we've got are simple correlations of data. And this is what I'm showing in this dashboard right here. That we can use some of the census data, we can use the existing household data, and we can see correlations and even correlations over time. And some of the things that you see in green there, those green boxes, are things that move together. And those are good candidates for clusters, because that means that they're already moving together, that given change, given economic change, given whatever is happening in our economy, these things move together. So it's good to know these beforehand so that we can create a strong focus on what are the things that we need to make, to focus on specifically. The yellow that you see in this dashboard are actually things that have no correlation between them. So this is more traditional, very targeted intervention into something that is uncorrelated to everything else. And when you see the pink and the red, what we're seeing is actually negative correlation. So if you have an industry put in place, you'll see a rise in carbon emissions, for example. So this is just a simple example, just so you can visualize that some things are not always going in the right, the arrows are not pointing in the right direction. So we have to go and take a close look at the data, and also focus first on the question, which is, what is the problem? So these are the steps that we use to define the problem for a cluster or for a combo approach. And step number 0 are the slides that I just shared with you, which is to try to show that there is an advantage of clustering and of creating a combo rather than going it on a gap-by-gap measure, which will fragment and which will create many, many more small programs, small projects with less impact. So we start first with that. But then the first real step in blue is defining the problem. And this is where we need a lot of imagination. We also need to go beyond our usual blinders, which are to think in a sectoral fashion. So if we ask the Minister of Education what the problem is, she or he will always say it's education. And what we should be able to say is it's not just education. We should be able to say the youth employment issues are related to education, but they're also related to other aspects, the private sector and other issues correlated with that. So defining the problem becomes a first step that is usually done socially. We do this with people on the ground through social dialogue. But then the second part is something that you're aware of if you've done results-based management, which is building a theory of change. We need to have some hypothesis about what is not working on the ground right now. If we're focusing on youth employment, what is it that is not working? Because there probably is some sort of government program happening right now, but it's not working. So, or it is working and we need to expand it, or we need to change it or tweak it in some way. And this is where we do the best analysis that we can. We work with focus groups, we work with anthropologists, sociologists, depending on what the issue is, and we also use all the available data in trying to tell a story of what impacts what has most impact over our desired outcome. So think of the combo as citizen insecurity or malnutrition or extreme poverty or violence against women. And each of these is a multidimensional problem. It's something that cannot be cured with a silver bullet, but we do need to think through the tree of cause and effect. So that's something that we would do with you in this approach, and you'll be looking at this over the next few weeks. The third step is defining interventions. Usually, as we think about interventions as acupuncture, what we find is that we have to have a very good information, good targets, and also good hypothesis about what works and what doesn't work. And usually, our hypothesis is that critical mass is what works. When we fragment, when we just do one thing at a time and then we wait a year and we go back with the second thing, that doesn't work. And we've seen the examples again and again. Critical mass does work. If you intervene with 4 or 5 programs at the same time, with the same population, in the same year, then you see changes that have an impact for a critical mass of people. And finally, the fourth step is monitoring and evaluations. It has to do with the data issues that we already talked about. It has to do with being able to track even the logistical aspects of how to address a combo. I'm thinking of an example we have in Peru. We're working with the government on malnutrition and anemia. And what they've done is they've created a monitoring and evaluation system that reports on anemia for hundreds of thousands of people every month. And they just collect information very cheaply with cell phones, with an app. And they have a logistical chain, and it looks a lot like a UPS package delivery system, because it lets you track how they follow through with the iron pills, with changes in nutrition and diet, in the school diet, and the hospital diet, and the family changes in nutrition patterns over time. So we've seen this working as a logistical chain, but then we also collect data on impact, which is anemia still present 1 year later? Is malnutrition still present 2 years later? And that's the kind of traditional development work that we've done in many countries. Okay, so I'm just going to show you 3 examples of work that we're already doing in the region. This first one is from municipalities from El Salvador. And this is an inspiration for us because they started doing this work 2 years ago, before the SDG agenda was even approved, and before we had any idea what a cluster or a combo approach was. But they formulated the problem as a multidimensional problem. They said citizen insecurity is not just about violence. It's about other things like youth employment, like education, like access to justice, even things like education on masculinities and how people relate to violence. So what they found is they went in municipality by municipality, in parish by parish. What they found is that they would tweak it a little bit. In some places, the big issue was access to justice. In the other places, the key issue was youth employment. And in most places, a common issue was education and access to education and to jobs. So they tweaked it and they created a program or a combo which is different in each parish, in each municipality. And that is now the basis of their SDG agenda at the national level. So now they're working in dozens of municipalities, and they're able to tailor it to the needs of each type of constituency. So this is something that has inspired our work and has made us think hard about how to progress. This is a second example that comes from Honduras, and Honduras has one of the hemisphere's highest rates of extreme poverty and of malnutrition. And we focused with the government on the highest of the highest rates. So we're going to the red area, which has literally the highest rates of malnutrition and child mortality in the whole of the Americas. And we're creating a combo approach because we know that it's not just about access to health services. It's not just about access to water. It's also about empowering women. It's also about changing some food habits. It's also about changing access to labor markets and so on. So what we're trying to do is diagnose around the issue of malnutrition. We're trying to diagnose what that tree looks like and creating a basket of interventions with the government that will go household to household, sweeping through using this administrative registry system that Honduras set up just 12 months ago, which is quite phenomenal. And I always use the example of Honduras because when I visited 2 years ago, there was no data. There was no census. There was no household data. There was nothing. There was no demographic data. And now they have registries for 4 million people across the country. All of the poor and vulnerable are registered, and they're going into the second panel, which means that they'll have 2 observations on these 4 million people. And that's quite remarkable in 12 months' time. So I invite you to take a look at that example. That's something that we're building on with our colleagues in UNDP Honduras. Finally, I myself am involved in this cluster work with Oaxaca. We're working with some of the poorest Mexican states, Oaxaca, Chiapas, Campeche, some of the poorest states that were involved in violence in the past, and this is where the guerrillas war, and this was a place that was quite violent just 10, 15 years ago. But the legacy of violence has left a lot of destitution, a lot of poverty, a lot of malnutrition. So we're focusing our combo in Oaxaca on extreme poverty, using multidimensional measures. And again, they also have administrative registries in Mexico. So we know that the population of Oaxaca is 900,000 people. And we know that the extreme poor are 320,000. And we know that the moderate poor are 185,000. And we know that the rest are in transition in demographic flux into the middle class. So we can target different municipalities, different parishes in this region. And we're creating a program with the Mexican government to go dimension by dimension of the multidimensional poverty index and attack each one of those disparities. All right, so I'm wrapping up now. Just as final comments, I think one of the interesting things that we've learned over the past few months with the landing of the SDG agenda is that the SDG agenda, unlike past agendas, invites us to look at the structural issues of each of our countries. And sometimes the only structural issue that we used to look at was economic. We usually focused on the determinants of economic growth. We looked at productivity, innovation, technology. This is fantastic. This is good. But we've learned from the past few years that that's not enough, that we need to look at the structural constraints posed by the environment, by natural disasters, by structural vulnerabilities. We also need to look at the structural constraints posed by social policy or lack of social policy, thinking about female labor participation, about youth employment, about multidimensional poverty. And what we found is that growth is not good enough, is that despite having good growth in many countries, we're not able to grow the middle class. We're not able to address some of the hardest exclusions. We're not able to address some of the natural disasters or the vulnerability from climate change. So we need to scale it up. And that's what this approach is all about. The combo approach is about scaling up and not fragmenting, and thinking about what are the 2 or 3 structural issues in our country. They don't all have to be the same. They don't even have to be similar. Each country is different. And I would say even parishes and municipalities inside a country are different. So we need to think territorially as well. Some of the examples that I've used have to do with hard exclusions, multidimensional poverty, risk of falling back into poverty. But I think that doesn't absolve us thinking of other issues that have to do with employment, that have to do with vulnerabilities, that have to do with health, that have to do with fiscal space and other structural issues in each of our countries. So this is just an invitation for all of you to think about what is the high-hanging fruit that we need to deal with, because the low-hanging fruit will be addressed by economic growth. We know that. There's a lot of good things that come with economic growth, but there's a lot of things that do not come with economic growth, and that's something that we've learned over the past 15 years. So the UN and the UNDP wants to tackle those issues that are not solved by economic growth, and those we call high-hanging fruit. The growth-related progress we call low-hanging fruit, which is good. We should be doing that, but we think the UN should be spending our precious resources on focusing on the most vulnerable, on the most structural issues for each country. So let me stop here. There's a lot more that you'll be engaging with on this agenda. I've just really touched the superficial aspect of what a cluster approach looks like. There's so many things going on, including fiscal analysis, including institutional analysis, that I'm happy to talk to you about later. But I just wanted to stop here, and I'll pass it over to my colleague and friend, Kenroy Roach, to follow up with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Before passing the word to Kenroy, George made an amazing presentation, and I think most of the gathering of information analysis that he's sharing resonates a lot with the Caribbean. And then, of course, as we said, there are specificities. Definitely, as George was touching upon economic growth in the Caribbean, as we know, is a key component of the Caribbean narrative of the HCR, focused a lot in how to work on economic growth and resilience at the same time. So Kenroy will now be leading us through his line of thoughts and the findings and the work being done in the Caribbean. And at the end of the remarks, we have Maria Jose Abud, who will also be leading us through the training in the coming weeks with the questions and answers and with the closing of this webinar. So with no further ado, Kenroy, thank you so much. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, George, for an excellent presentation. I think you've set it up very nicely for what I'm about to say. Just to apologize to the colleagues, I saw the consistent feedback about the slides being in Spanish. We take note, and I'm sure, as I saw Alejandro reassuring during the presentation, we'll ensure that these slides are translated into English and made available for colleagues who are asking for them. George touched on a very important issue, which is the issue of growth, and made the point that more growth does not necessarily lead to poverty reduction and improvement in the quality of life. And that is very, very true for all parts of the world, including the Caribbean. But as Alejandro just mentioned, in the Caribbean Human Development Report of 2016, we make the point that it is important in the Caribbean for us to re-jump or re-energize the growth agenda, because indeed there's still some low-hanging fruits which need to be addressed. Which we believe that growth can help, and then definitely going beyond growth will require us to focus more on those multidimensional interventions or those multidimensional solutions that can tackle some of the harder, more structural and difficult challenges. For this presentation, sorry, actually I should have introduced myself, I just realized. So I'm Kenroy Roach. I work for UNDP in the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean, and as Alejandro mentioned at the beginning, I was one of the lead authors for the Caribbean Human Development Report. George touched on quite a few of the things that I planned to say, so let me just, for this presentation, what I want to do is focus on how we can use the Combos methodology in the Caribbean, recognizing the limitations of data in the Caribbean, which I'm sure a lot of us who are on this call that listened to the presentation immediately was thinking about as George was presenting those excellent examples from Latin America and the Caribbean. So what I'm going to focus on really is just to reflect on how we've been using the COMBOS methodology in the context of the MAPS missions. Now, just very quickly, let me say that the key messages from my presentation are as follows. One, the first is that I think that the COMBOS approach is going to be extremely, and has indeed shown already, that it's extremely important for the Caribbean, because it moves from the unidimensional view of development to a more multidimensional view of development. And we know from Agenda 2030 that it's a much more complex agenda, that it challenges us to leave no one behind, and that for us to achieve that, it will require a more integration between economic, social, and environmental policies. It would also require us to sort of think more deeply and differently about how we organize our public policy architecture, so that we can bring the different parts of government together to work on these issues. And that's a point that George made too in his presentation. The second key message for me from this presentation is that COMBOS requires evidence. And I just want to make the point that while the presentation that we just saw focused heavily on the quantitative elements, which I think is absolutely critical, and an issue I'm going to come back to in the context of the Caribbean, I do believe that there is a lot that we know already about what works and what doesn't work. And therefore, we could try to use some qualitative approaches to come up with some of this analysis, which hopefully, as our data systems become more robust, we can test through some of the empirical quantitative approaches that we saw being used in some parts of Latin America. So my main point here is that let's also think about how we can use the COMBOS from a qualitative perspective. And in that context, I think those of us who are familiar with theories of change, for example, will understand that, you could, for example, look at evaluative evidence in terms of constructing some of the theories about the interconnection between, let's say, root problems and the desired outcomes that we're attempting to achieve. And then thirdly, just to say that I think the COMBOS methodologies we've seen through the MAPS missions, it really does present an opportunity for us to break some of the silos that we see in our policy making and project management and program management across, in this case, the Caribbean and indeed many parts of the world. Because as you'll see, what we try to do through this approach is think about what are the different dimensions of the problem. And by thinking of what are the different dimensions of the problem, the logical question then becomes, who needs to be at the table to be able to design the kinds of multidimensional solutions or strategies that are necessary to attack the problem. So those are the three key messages from me. Now, in terms of the Caribbean, as I'm sure we know very well, and it has been suggested already, the region finds itself in a very interesting position in this juncture in its history, where across the region we've seen a stalling of economic growth over the last decade. We've seen across many countries negative economic growth. And I'm happy to say that last year, 2016, we've seen some signs that the region is now emerging from the impact of the global financial crisis in 2008. And in fact, in countries like Jamaica, we're now seeing last year they posted a 1.6%, I think, or 1.3% growth, economic growth rate, which is important and a very positive sign. But having said that, many of the countries across the region, as we know, are still struggling. And therefore, in this SDG era, the question of how to finance the SDG agenda becomes an extremely important question. Now, we also know that there are some issues with respect to the Caribbean's vulnerability, climate variability, in particular natural disaster shocks and financial shocks make it much more difficult for the region to make the kinds of investments that are necessary to restart or to jumpstart the growth agenda, but also it affects the region's ability to invest in the social sectors. And we've seen, for example, in the Caribbean UN Development Report of 2016, that there has been a stalling of the progress that we have seen in years prior on the UN Development Index, that most countries have not been able to sustain. If you look at the region over the last 5 years, the sort of positive trajectory that we had seen prior to the 2008 economic crisis. So there is certainly something to be said for the link between the economic agenda and improving the economic growth in the region and the level of investment on the social and indeed the environmental side, recognizing that there are links between environment and poverty reduction. And then just thirdly, in terms of context in the region, we know that the SDG agenda, as I mentioned earlier, is a much more complex agenda and therefore will require more sophisticated tools and approaches to be able to deliver on the promise and the ambition. SDG, the Agenda 2030, we know is supposed to be a transformative one, and indeed, if pursued in all of the dimensions, can be transformative. But as I mentioned, for the region, the three key issues in terms of pursuing the agenda, where I believe the combos might be relevant for us to think about how to address these issues, are certainly the issue of data and how to improve evidence in our policy making and better use of data generally. The issue of financing, which I've touched on in terms of fiscal room for maneuver in the region, and then certainly the issue of implementation deficit. I think the Caribbean, and just coming back from last week, the SDG conference in Jamaica, where we were lucky to have the presence of a lot of the very senior political and academic leadership in the region. What we have seen is that there is a huge implementation deficit, that a lot of the solutions that we know are now necessary for correcting or for advancing in the SDG agenda, those solutions are simply not being implemented, that a lot of them have been thought about already in the region. For example, in areas such as energy and looking at the issue of transitioning to more renewable energy, the issue of data, the issue of debt. There are a lot of solutions that are on the table, but part of the challenge is the region has not been able to move on some of these solutions, so that the question of how to improve the implementation, especially given that under the Agenda 2030, it will require stronger institutions and more capacities to be able to deliver on, or better use of existing capacities at minimum, to be able to better deliver on these issues. So, how are we addressing these in the context of where is the Caribbean going next? Now, UNDP, in the context of the UN Development Group, UNDG, has been rolling out what we call the MAPS, which I referenced earlier. And MAPS stands for mainstreaming, which looks at the issue of how to ensure that the SDG goals and targets are well reflected in international development plans and policies. The A in MAPS stands for acceleration, and George has already made the nice connection between the combos and acceleration, and I'll come shortly to how we've been using the combos to support the Caribbean on the acceleration agenda. But acceleration, if I had to define it, it's really about increasing the rate of development progress across the region. Or in other words, what are those interventions that we can pursue at a country level that has the greatest chance of moving the dial on the SDG, or improving the rate of development progress. And as you heard earlier, a key element of the combos is about, how can we identify those critical interventions or acupuncture points that, when pursued, can have multiple dividends, that can touch as many SDG goals and targets as possible, And this is extremely important for the Caribbean because, as I said, given the fiscal challenges, we know that it is not possible to go goal by goal or gap by gap. And therefore, we have to find a way to be able to get the biggest bang for the buck, or get the best from the limited investments that we can make in the region. And therefore, this idea of identifying accelerators linked to a strong theory of change that is evidence informed becomes extremely critical. And then the P and the S in MAPS stands for policy support. And that has to do with how can we bring the collective experience of the UN system, but I would also argue other critical stakeholders in the private sector, from academia and other key stakeholders, to support government in being able to address that. And so under the MAPS, which I'm sure some of you have heard of before, we've been trying to support the Caribbean, as indeed we're doing as UNDP in many other regions in the world, in advancing on the SDG agenda. And as I said, the MAPS framework, we have been using the COMBOS methodology as a way to help countries to come up with what we call an SDG roadmap, or an SDG implementation plan, which looks at some key interventions over the next 5 years that can help the country to advance on the SDG agenda. Now, let me just very quickly say, in terms of how have we been reflecting the COMBOS in the MAPS. And I'm not going to go through all the different elements of the MAPS, but I'm going to come to one of the elements, because there are several elements to the work, to the SDG roadmap that we normally develop, and I'm just going to focus here now on the MAPS and the COMBOS, and how the COMBOS fit into it. So as I mentioned, we've been using COMBOS in the A element of the MAPS, the acceleration, which has to do with identifying accelerators and moving from planning to action. So what we've been doing, we've done this so far in Trinidad and Tobago. For example, in the case of Jamaica, one of the key issues that we addressed as part of the process of constructing a combo for the government of Jamaica was the issue of inclusive growth. Now, we were fortunate in the case of Jamaica to be able to have the benefit of the analysis that was done for the Caribbean Human Development Report, and the good work that was done under the POV-risk analysis, that is looking at factors that move people in and out of poverty. But one important issue for the government of Jamaica was to try and understand that why is the poverty rate not decreasing, notwithstanding the investments that have been made over the years in poverty reduction in Jamaica. And so the key issue is, how do we in fact achieve poverty reduction, but also how do we ensure that we can link poverty reduction to growth? And that is, how do we ensure that the country, that Jamaica, benefits from inclusive economic growth now that we are seeing the country returning to some growth? And so in the case of Jamaica, based on the analysis and here we brought together many of the stakeholders, we had the benefit of the poverty risk analysis that was done. And through the deliberate judgment of the multidisciplinary team that were involved in the MAPS exercise, plus the analysis of the combo and indeed the government's own Economic Growth Council, we were able to identify three dimensions to the problem of economic growth that hopefully, if addressed, can help to achieve inclusive economic growth in Jamaica. The first had to do with SME procurement, and this is important because in the context of poverty reduction, it's really about how do you create more employment opportunities for those that are not benefiting from economic growth, those that certainly don't have jobs. And how do we ensure that the government's investment in services across the country can translate to job creation for those that are unemployed. And so by looking at the issue of how to increase the share of government's procurement that goes directly to SMEs, that's one way that the analysis, concluded that we could stimulate employment. So very deliberately helping the government to look at its public procurement system and ensuring that there are inbuilt mechanisms within the public procurement system that allows particularly rural enterprises to get some access to government procurement. Another issue linked to the issue of inclusive growth or growth with equity was the whole issue of supply chains in agriculture, and looking at how to ensure that rural enterprises, again, particularly in the agriculture sector, can be linked to the tourism sector, and trying to create the value chain to be able to get goods, agricultural goods that are being produced in that sector to the large tourism operators in Jamaica. And then, of course, the issue of inclusive finance is the third pillar, and that is looking at how to ensure that these small enterprises in agriculture and other key growth sectors in Jamaica can have a better, more reliable access to financing to support the business development and expansion. So really looking at these three elements, recognizing that for you to be able to achieve this kind of growth, you will definitely need, for you to achieve equity in growth, you will definitely need to address the issue of employment and focusing on youth and women, and ensuring that employment actually deliver the benefits of that growth deliver the benefits of employment to these groups. And then in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, looking at the combos approach again, one of the issues how to improve social protection systems, and looking at what are some of the issues around social protection, not just in the social sector, but in other sectors that are driving the inability of the social protection system to help people to transition into more productive, sustainable lives. And here, in the case of Trinidad, looking at the issue of, for example, single registry of beneficiaries, noting that in Trinidad there are about 200 social protection projects or programs in the government, and how to sort of bring that together, which is linked also to the issue of targeting, is linked to the issue of results-based budgeting, it's linked to issues around care services, and so forth. So again, looking at the social protection from a multidimensional perspective and trying to identify the interventions, such as, for example, improving coordination among sectors, removing barriers to entry for specific groups that are benefiting, that should be benefiting, that are not benefiting from the social protection system, strengthening evidence base to inform policies, minimizing leakages, and so on and so forth. So again, constructing a multidimensional view instead of just going at it from a narrow lens, by linking it to the economic sector, linking it to other sectors. And then finally in Aruba was the issue of natural resources management and how to improve or how to transition from unsustainable natural resource management to more sustainable natural resource management. And here looking for solutions again outside of the environment sector, recognizing that the economic sector is one of the key drivers of an unsustainable way of managing natural resources, and trying to identify the different interventions, be it financing type interventions, working with private sector, creating marine protected area systems, etc., to address those issues. Now, as I said earlier, in the case of Jamaica, we were lucky to have good data. In the case of Trinidad and Aruba, the data systems weren't as strong. So a next step for us as UNDP in supporting these countries is to test some of these connections which have been identified through discussion with technocrats in government, academics, and other stakeholders, private sector and other stakeholders. So to help to identify the evidence base that can inform some of the connections that are being made through these interventions. So I know you've been listening a long time. Just let me stop there and pass it back to, I think it may be Alejandro, who will moderate the rest of this webinar. Thank you.
Hello, Kenroy. I guess I'll take over from New York. This is George Gray Molina again. There was a number of interesting questions that were sent via the chat and conversation. So what I can do is go through 2 or 3 of these questions, and I'll give it back to Alejandro. The first one was made by Rosemary, and it's about the interesting question of how do we, given that this is so data intensive, that all of the work that we're doing is so data intensive, how do we make sure that we can scale it up to practice, that we can make it all the way up to the national level with this kind of approach? What I have found over the past few months is actually that's a good question, and we found 2 examples in which countries have scaled up, starting with a very defined problem. So in El Salvador, it was citizen insecurity, and it mostly had to do with youth unemployment and citizen insecurity. So I would say the data sets that were needed for that were constructed over a 12, 18-month period of time. And today we can say El Salvador has a state-of-the-art system based on administrative registries just for that issue and associated problems that have to do with youth employment and citizen insecurity. But a second example is Peru. They're focused on the issues of malnutrition and and they collected data on iron insufficiency. And I think they started in only a couple of municipalities, a couple of regions, and now they've scaled up. They've gone national. They have a full set in everything in a set of about 9 months. So I think it happens problem by problem. But you're right that it would be almost impossible to scale this up for every issue of the SDG agenda, or even for most issues of the SDG agenda. I think, again, my own predilection is that the SDG acceleration agenda should focus on the hardest questions. And the hardest questions are usually 2 or 3 issues that are interrelated. And they're not 50 or not 100. So I think that's mostly where I see it coming. Second and third questions have to do with administrative registries. There was a question about how do we follow up with the people who benefit from policies, and also isn't there an issue of privacy and confidentiality? And I think these are good questions. There's definitely an issue of privacy and confidentiality. What we've seen both in Dominican Republic and in Honduras, there are what they call blind data sets. So they have the registries, they have a common ID number that is based on a national ID, but they don't make these available to the public. So what the public can see is use of data that is already processed, or decision makers can actually use the data, almost primary data that goes down to the parish level, down to the household level, without getting into the names of people. So there's even legislation passed to protect people from the use of their names in Mexico and also in Brazil. So I think that's a good question. I think that's something that can be addressed. And the other issue is how to follow people. What we've learned is that in the past, these registries of beneficiaries used to be just based on almost demand-driven. People would sign up to some conditional transfer, and then they would be in a registry. Well, now we've moved to a different strategy, which is systematically sweeping through a region, a territory, a municipality, and going to all the households that are vulnerable or poor, defined by the National Statistics Institute or some official guidance. And in that way, what we find with this new sweep is that it's almost like a census. We're creating a baseline in which we're not just gathering information on those people who are being followed, if you will, by an intervention of the state, but of all people, regardless of their having received or not a transfer or a subsidy or something from the government. So that has changed the dynamics, and it's made it more universal, and it's also made it less threatening, if you will, less of a privacy issue. So it's like doing a census again. And then finally, there was a question about how to begin thinking about the clusters with combos. If there's so many types of data that we have, or maybe different types of cleavages, we can think urban and rural. We can think of people with certain types of poverty. We can think of youth who are in poverty and so on. How do we start? And what you'll see over the next few weeks in the work that Maria Jose has done, it's so important to think about, systematically think about what the problem will be, what the 2 or 3 problems will be, because that's the way we cut the cake later. If we decide hastily that it's a rural-urban issue, then we're stuck with that. So I think it's much more interesting to focus on a population like youth employment, for example, like teenage pregnancy, for example, like youth at risk of violence, for example. So these are populations that we can track territorially and also by age group, and we can map them out, and we can begin sort of a cluster-based approach with them, a combo-based approach. So I think that's some of the things that we've been learning. But thank you all for these interesting questions. There's a few questions for Ken Roy, so I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, George, for that. Alejandro has to leave, so I will continue with the moderation, but first I will introduce myself. My name is Maria Jose, and I'm part of the virtual course. I'm going to be a professor, so please, if you have any doubt or question about the course of any type, you can email me or you can use our forum. So now I think that we have only one question for Ken Roy. It's from Doreen, that she asked about the best organizational structure for combo implementation. She asked specifically of the case of Curacao, and she asked if we be getting some good examples that we can offer to the national government. And also there is a question for George, that is, so did the governments have to pass an administrative registry law before beginning to collect the household info? So I give the microphone to you, Ken Roy or George.
Sure. Thank you, Maria Jose. On the question from Doreen. Hi, Doreen. Yes, definitely we have collected a number of examples across the world, in fact, on how to set up these implementation structures, these organizational structures for implementation. Of course, the issue is, with, as I mentioned in the presentation, with an agenda that requires more integration and working across the different pillars of sustainable development. The challenge becomes then, how do you actually bring them together? How do you bring these sectors, these pillars, or the agencies that work within these pillars together? And what you'll notice from what we have done is, for example, if you start with even the RIA, the RIA is the Rapid Integrated Assessment, which I believe is going to be part of the training that is going to be done over the next few weeks. If you look at the way we do this Rapid Integrated Assessment, which looks at how much of the SDG goals and targets are already reflected through government's existing plans, what we do in the RIA is we're also looking to see which institutional players have responsibilities for these goals and targets. And already through this assessment, which is the starting point of the MAPS process that I spoke to, and of course I recognize that I hadn't gone through all of the elements of MAPS, I just focused on the combos, but in the RIA, we're already seeing how responsibilities for different pillars or different targets are spread across many agencies within government, which gives us a sense of who needs to be at the table, linked to each goal and target, to be able to do more joined up planning and policy making in that area. But definitely yes, the short answer is yes. There are good examples. I think what came out of the MAPS mission to Trinidad is going to be very instructive for the Caribbean, where instead of creating thematic groups in environment, in social and economic, what they have in fact done is try to create joined up groups that look at common issues like resources and monitoring and evaluation, and actually one that is called accelerators, recognizing that these accelerators don't necessarily speak to issues in just one sector, and that you need to bring different people together. So they've actually taken a deliberate decision to break out of classifying things as economic, environment, and social to looking at them more from an integrated way and bringing different stakeholders. But we will certainly share those examples more with you and others as we go through this process. George, over to you on the law and administrative registries.
Certainly, yes. Thank you, Doreen. I think the key thing here, from what I've seen, is that usually the access to registry starts from one small program that then melds into another program that is larger. So eventually you have 2 or 3 programs that are collecting data on people. And once you get to the step where you're creating a unique registry, where you want to have a single identification code and you want to sweep through a larger group of the population, then that's where you start to get the legal issues. And yes, countries have passed legislation. I'm thinking about countries like Chile, Brazil, Mexico, who have quite sophisticated and large administrative registries. But I think they had a lot of learning by doing, because they started these things 10 or 15 years ago, and they're just now starting to deal with the legal complexities of, now that we have a unique registry, a single dashboard, then, well, we need to protect privacy data and so on. So I think that's, if we're to jumpstart a registry right now, we would have to deal with the whole architecture of the system, which is the legal, but also the institutional side of how to collect data and how to get the technological access to that. I think the excellent examples right now, again, are Dominican Republic and Honduras, who have really picked up and created administrative registries out of nothing in 18 months. So that's something that I encourage everyone to look at. Back to you, Kenroy. Maria Jose.
Thank you very much, George and Kenroy, for your excellent presentations and for all your answers to each question that we have today. And I think that with this, we are closing our webinar. I want to thank you, everyone, to be part of this. You're very welcome to our course, and we really hope that you will enjoy and you will learn a lot about the tools to land the Agenda 2030 in our region. So please, if you have any type of question, use our forum, or you can email us, and we will be happy to help you. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.